Indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Hello there, I'm Brian Hyde, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. We're going to be talking about ranked choice voting and open primaries, and, well, actually, we're just going to sum it up as gaming Idaho's election system. Now, there are many different kinds of activism. One of the most common types that we run into, though, are activists who game the system. In other words, they think they are so smart, they will actually play the system or play the people who run the system against everybody else to the perceived advantage or to the perceived agenda of the activist. It's not a good thing. And it's definitely at play in this particular issue. So I'm going to share with you a couple of commentaries, one of them very much in favor of the open choice, or I'm sorry, the open primary, at least that's what they're calling it, and also in favor of ranked choice voting. We'll start with Jim Jones, and then Brian Allman from the Idaho Freedom Foundation has, I think, an excellent case of his own against ranked choice voting and open primaries. But I'm going to start with Jim, and I'm going to ask you to please pay attention to a couple of things as I share these differing points of view. Number one, I will ask you, please pay attention to who is invoking fear, who is name-calling, who is trying to spur outrage rather than persuade. And it shouldn't be too hard to tell. I think there's such a night and day difference between these two approaches. Jim Jones, we'll let seniority go first here. His most recent editorial, or his most recent column, I should say, published in magicvalley.com, what 2022 Alaska elections can tell us about ranked choice voting. Now, by the way, just for the record, I do have a couple of good friends in Alaska with whom I communicate on a pretty regular basis, and the reports are mixed. One of them, who actually works for a think tank there in Alaska, was saying, you know, I was kind of for it, but it's very clear that there's a reason why a career politician won out, and it was because of ranked choice voting. The other one, this friend is just a lifelong diehard conservative. He's actually served and held elected office before too, and he says it's an absolute travesty. It's a way to again game the system and shift things when you don't have the actual power or the actual votes to do so. So with that in mind, let's see what Jim has to tell us about what Alaska's elections from 2022 can tell us about ranked choice voting. He says the Dorothy Moon faction of the Idaho Republican Party has enlisted Sarah Palin to speak in Idaho Falls this weekend about the supposed evils of ranked choice voting. Palin's 2022 loss of her statewide race for Congress in Alaska should provide a ray of hope to the vast number of what Jim calls pragmatic, reasonable Idaho Republicans who feel they've been pushed out of their party by Moon's narrow, super committed, extremist branch of the GOP. Jim Jones goes on to say, Palin did not lose because of ranked choice. Instead, he says she fell out of favor with Alaska voters. The reliably conservative Cato Institute points out that while Palin was losing her election bid, Alaska Republicans were having one of their best state house showings ever. The state's GOP governor and senator were reelected, and Republican candidates did just fine in legislative races. Palin was viewed as having neglected Alaska and its important concerns, while her opponent had a record of working across the aisle to advance Alaska's natural resource interests. Alaska races became more civil, says Jim, competitive, and issue-oriented with ranked choice because the candidates had to campaign to a wider audience of voters instead of just the ones farthest to the right. Isn't that interesting? Now, he goes on to say, in contrast, since the Idaho GOP closed its primary in 2012, right-wing extremists have seized control of most of the party structure. Primaries have become divisive, focusing mainly on made-up culture war issues that do nothing to address serious problems facing the state. I would remind you, this is Jim's common refrain. None of that stuff you parents are concerned about that your kids are learning or is being forced on them in school, none of that's happening. But, aside from it all being made up, there are more important things like how do we squeeze more money out of the taxpayer? Nevertheless, he says with the heavy-handed support of the so-called Idaho Freedom Foundation and out-of-state dark money, extremist candidates have been able to make elective office almost unattainable for what he calls responsible, pragmatic Republicans. Now, he says, I believe traditional Republicans outnumber the extremists, but the extremist branch is much louder, adept at weaponizing non-issues, and continually grasping for power. Like I say, pay attention to when you see what the other side of this looks like. Centralization of party control amongst a small group of party bosses is the hallmark of Moon's agenda. Purging a variety of loyal Republicans. Now, I got to take issue. Loyal meaning they follow the party platform and what it represents, or loyal to the powers that be, the establishment, who sometimes run afoul of that platform. Like a little clarification there, Jimmer, if you don't mind. Thanks so much. Moon's self-proclaimed goal of turning the GOP into a private club. Can you show a direct quote where she ever said that, by the way? I notice you're using quotation marks. That most Idahoans can only observe from the sidelines. Sounds pretty scary, doesn't it? Now, Latah County party bosses are subjecting Representative Lori McCann, whom Jim calls an exemplary legislator, to a grilling to see if she measures up to their extreme right view of the world. She will undoubtedly be censured or reprimanded if it turns out that she uses her brain. I think she was actually censured. And so apparently she is at odds with them. But you don't really tell us why, though, Jim. I wonder why that is. Nothing like that would happen to Senator Dan Foreman, who Jim says is a disgrace to his legislative office, without telling us why Senator Foreman is a disgrace. Incidentally, he says ranked choice voting could weed out extremists like Forum. Indeed, a far-right group, Action Idaho, has described how ranked choice would have sunk conservatives like extremists Chris Tracol, Elaine Price, and Joe Alfieri in the 2022 primary. I don't think they actually used the words extremists. I think that's Jim's word, but that's what he would like you to believe. Is, hey, us extremists, we couldn't win if it weren't for, having a closed primary. Jim Jones says the closed GOP primary resulted in Idaho's 2022 loss of responsible Republican legislators like Senators Jim Patrick, Carl Crabtree, Jim Woodward, and Jeff Eigenbrod, as well as Representatives Greg Cheney, Paul Amador, Scott Syme, and Jim Addis. Unless, he says, other reasonable Republicans could fall to the extremists in future elections unless the open primaries initiative is enacted by the people. Now, again, I'm saying watch for the name calling, watch for the fear mongering. Some have said they would prefer a top two primary like those in Washington or California, or an open primary like Idaho had from 1930 until 2010. However, it does not make sense to hope that someday one of those options will magically materialize. What he calls the extremist-controlled legislature will never enact an election reform measure that will break the grip of the extremists on Idaho elections. Reform, says Jim Jones, can only come by way of a voter initiative. I wonder if it's because the people are easier to fool, or if it's easier to fool low-information voters than people who have an actual stake in the matter. I'm just wondering aloud. That's just a question worth considering. Anyway, Jim says there are only two ways forward in the foreseeable future. Either we continue with a dysfunctional, closed GOP primary that has turned the Idaho political arena into a pointless gladiator spectacle, or we opt for real reform via the open primaries initiative. Now, the initiative may not be perfect in everyone's eyes, as you will soon see, but it will be a major victory for the many thousands of traditional Republicans and independent voters who yearn for a return to reasonable, responsible government leadership in the Gem State. And thus concludes Jim's sermon. So, there's Jim's take on it. If you don't enact this, if the citizens aren't allowed to do this, why, the state's going to fall to extremists. And boy, he doesn't hold back on the use of that word, now does he? So let's take a look at another, what I would consider maybe a little more nuanced view of what the ranked choice voting and not so much open primary, but jungle primary represents. For this, I turn to Brian Allman. And if you haven't subscribed to Brian's Substack, gemstate.substack.com, it'd be a good idea. Whether you agree with him or not is irrelevant. If you just want a broader view of what's going on and a very well-informed take, I think Brian does a marvelous job. By the way, his take on this ranked choice voting initiative is it's nothing short of a plan to turn Idaho blue forever, which I think is kind of the unstated goal of activists like Jim Jones. Brian says more than 10 years ago, the Idaho Republican Party decided to close its primary election. Now, this meant that anyone participating in the Idaho GOP primary must be a registered Republican. Now, that seems obvious, right? Only Republicans can choose the Republican nominee, just as only Democrats should choose the Democratic nominee. Or to put it another way, the Green Bay Packers don't get to choose the New England Patriots starting quarterback. Fair enough. He says, but this decision was met with much wailing and gnashing of teeth at the time. Since Idaho has a Republican supermajority, many leftists and moderates believe they should have the right to select the Republican nominee. The Idaho GOP had to sue then Secretary of State Ben Isursa to gain control over its own internal elections, and a federal court ruled that forcing parties to participate in open primaries was unconstitutional. Interesting, Jim didn't mention anything of that. He's kind of a law and order guy. So if you're a leftist in Idaho, says Brian Allman, you surely recognize that the real election is in the May Republican primary, not the November general election. Therefore, doing whatever you can to influence that primary is an entirely rational action. The Idaho GOP, nevertheless, is responsible for protecting the integrity of its nomination process. This is perhaps why a coalition of left-wing groups have come up with a plan to completely restructure Idaho's election system to the detriment of conservatives. And he says this plan involves two major changes to the way that elections are conducted in our state. Now, he goes into a lot of detail here, and I'm only going to give you a few excerpts, but again, I think we hit the high points. He says leftist activists still looking for ways to co-opt the Republican Party have altered their tactics, so you have former Republicans such as Jim Jones actively urging progressive Democrats to register as Republican so as to vote for the more leftist candidate into the 2022 GOP primary. Jim, that's a little game in the system, wouldn't you say? Turnout numbers, by the way, suggest that thousands of Democrats did just that. In response, the Idaho GOP passed some additional rules that intend to prevent Democrats from switching parties right before the primary. In other words, do they have to just sit back and let someone game the system? So the partisan primary where Republican voters vote for the Republican nominee would be abolished. In its place would be a top four primary where all candidates are on the ballot and voters choose any one of them. The top four vote getters would then advance to the general election regardless of party affiliation or lack thereof. I can see some third-party people going, hey, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea, but hold on, we'll get to that in just a moment. Brian also says, rather than our current first-past-the-post system, the general election would be conducted via an instant runoff, also known as ranked choice voting. So in this system, voters rank their candidates by order of preference, and the votes are counted in multiple rounds. If nobody receives an outright majority, then the lowest vote getter is eliminated. Ballots that had that unfortunate candidate ranked first would be counted for whomever the voter ranked second. And then that process continues till one candidate has a majority, who is then declared the winner. See how simple that is? Not? It's a little complicated. But the issue that people have with runoff elections is that they take more time, they cost more money, and they don't attract the same level of turnout as the regular election. So, for instance, Boise's 2019 runoff saw about 46,000 voters compared to nearly 52,000 who voted on Election Day. Ranked choice voting creates an instant runoff where a voter's second or third choice might end up winning. Now, Brian Allman goes on to say, in any case, the Reclaim Idaho's proposed initiative would not use ranked choice voting within a closed Republican primary, and this is a key distinction. Instead, what it would create is a blanket primary that advances the top four vote getters regardless of party, and then use ranked choice voting in the general. So you bring in any and all comers. Can you see why the Republicans might have a little bit of problem with that? Now, for instance, the state of Alaska, which Jim referenced, is, well, see, this works just perfectly. It kept that extremist Sarah Palin, from running or from achieving a seat in Congress. Brian says the state of Alaska recently adopted ranked choice voting after a citizens' initiative that was endorsed by Senator Lisa Murkowski. Project Veritas, by the way, caught Murkowski's staffers bragging that the whole point of the scheme was to keep their boss in power. How come we don't hear much about that? As a politician, Murkowski has exhibited uncanny survival skills. She was originally appointed to the U.S. Senate by her father, Frank Murkowski, to fill his own seat when he was elected governor in 2002. Never able to shake the stench of nepotism, the younger Murkowski struggled in every subsequent election, yet she always found some way to win. How very fortunate for her and, her political affiliates. In 2004, running for election to a full term, Murkowski won with 46.6% of the vote. In 2010, she was defeated in the Republican primary by Joe Miller, but ran a write-in campaign for the general election with significant monetary support from PACs and Native groups. She won with 39.7% of the vote. In 2016, Murkowski again won without a majority, this time garnering 44.4%. So ranked choice voting appears to have provided Murkowski with another lifeline. And in the second round of the instant runoff, Murkowski led conservative Republican Kelly Tshibaka by only 449 votes, but benefited from being the second choice of voters who supported Democrat Patricia Chesbro, winning more than 90% of the remaining Democrat votes. Now, do you see what just happened there? Democrat voters joined forces with moderate Republicans to keep a moderate Republican in office. And Brian asks the question, is that the true purpose of bringing ranked choice voting to Idaho? Now, he says, as a poll worker, I've seen firsthand how confusing voting can be. Which polling place do you go to? Which ballot do you need? In some races, you vote for two candidates. In others, you can only vote for one. Oh, and don't forget to flip to the backside. I mean, how many people are really, schooled and up on this before they go out to vote? He says this all makes sense to people like you and me who are plugged into politics anyway, but what about those who aren't? Okay, the retail worker who stops at the polling place after a long day on his feet, the busy mother who needs to hurry up and get back to her children, or the senior citizen who wants to be heard but has trouble making sense of it all. Ranked choice voting puts confusion on steroids, making it that much harder for average citizens to fully take part in the process. Now, Brian Allman goes on to say, Reclaim Idaho collaborated with several other leftist groups to craft a petition that not only replaces our general election system with ranked choice voting, but replaces our closed partisan primary, with a top four jungle primary, in which all voters select from all candidates. Now, he says his former home state of Washington did something similar about a decade ago, switching to a top two primary system. And he says that created a situation where I often had to choose between two Democrats on the general election ballot. He says he talks about this initiative that may go before Idaho voters, and says it violates the single subject rule. This is one of the problems that Attorney General Raul Labrador had with it, presenting two major changes to Idaho law. Number one, the blanket primary and ranked choice voting in the general election in the same initiative. Reclaim Idaho attempted to submit their own title for the initiative, which, according to Idaho law, is the purview of the AG's office. Ranked choice voting violates the state constitution, which lays out how elections are to be tabulated. The U.S. Constitution says state legislatures, not citizens' initiatives, must determine the method of electing congressmen. And the initiative violates the rights of political parties, or the right of political parties as private organizations to select their own nominees. These were some of the major problems, again, that the Attorney General pointed out. Now, Reclaim Idaho and its friends have been promoting this initiative as one that will create what they call an open primary. In fact, the umbrella organization they created to write the initiative and gather the signatures is called Idahoans for Open Primaries. They contended, therefore, that the ballot title should refer to the proposed system as an open primary. But Brian Allman points out what they are proposing is clearly not an open primary. And Justice Colleen Zahn questioned the plaintiff's attorney on that subject, asking what happens if the commonly known term is inaccurate or incorrect. So I know they've been kind of tooting the victory. Well, yes, we were, the Attorney General has to rename this. And apparently that was as of last Friday. But it was not a complete sweeping victory. See, this is why it has to be. There are still problems that remain. And Brian Allman says, here's what's going on here, isn't it? Activists such as Reclaim Idaho founder Luke Mayville and the Idaho Democratic Party have joined forces with alleged Republicans like Jim Jones to push this initiative. And here's the reason why. They're tired of seeing Idahoans elect conservatives, and since they can't compete according to the rules of the current system, they want to change the rules. First past the post may not be a perfect system, but Brian says it's been used in the United States for centuries, allowing our ancestors to create the greatest country in the history of the world. And he says voters should beware of organizations and activists seeking to change long-established rules for capricious reasons. And I think he's not out of character in saying that. Now, you may disagree with me entirely, but in sharing those two commentaries, and one for and one against this so-called ranked choice voting and open, so-called open primaries, did you notice which one was very heavy on the pejorative, which relied on name-calling, fear-mongering, disgust, and despising of those who are not on its side? And then I would contrast that with Brian's, which I thought stated his case pretty clearly. I mean, he took a firm stand, but I didn't see him have to resort to the kind of, junior high locker room name calling that, a distinguished former attorney general and justice from the Idaho Supreme Court, was using. It just seems a little out of character. So you may still strongly disagree with closed primaries. You may still believe ranked choice voting is the answer to our political prayers. I tend to agree with Brian Allman that I think this is a way to water down the system, to game the system, to otherwise shift control to people who could not make it on the merits of electing candidates through regular party politics. And that's sad. But then again, I think, well, what's really at stake here? And I have to go off for just a minute here on the people that Jim Jones and others refer to endlessly as extremists. What exactly is it that makes them extreme? Because the only common thread that I have seen in the people that they tend to call out as, extremist individuals is that they have a commitment to freedom and they are not going to budge from it, meaning they have a commitment to limited government, to smaller and less costly government, to fiscal responsibility, and of course, maintaining boundaries where they need to be maintained. In some cases, that's around our kids. In some cases, that's in the classroom, teaching kids, inappropriate things. What's so extreme about that? I mean, it wasn't that long ago, not even a generation ago. That kind of a viewpoint would be seen as, very mainstream conservative, if not outright, just I'll say the word normal. That's how normal people thought. Government can be a blessing. It can be a good thing, but it needs to be kept small. Solve the problems at the lowest possible level. But that's not how activists, and particularly left-wing and moderate Republicans, tend to operate. They want power. Why do they want power so badly? And particularly, why do they want to game elections so that they can exercise that power? Well, I have an answer for you, courtesy of the great philosopher Lysander Spooner. He says, the principle that the majority have a right to rule the minority practically resolves all government into a mere contest between two bodies of men, as to which of them shall be masters and which of them slaves. Now, I know that's probably not the most politically correct way to say it, but I can't think of a better way to frame it. Why are people like Jim Jones and those of his ilk so intent on they've got to take the power away from these people who are determined to keep government limited to its intended role, which is to protect your God-given liberties? Why are they so upset about that? Why do they not like to see power limited? Because I can only presume that it's because they have plans that they know we probably wouldn't go along with willingly, but with a force of government behind us, by gosh, you have to. We got a majority in this election. Now you got to do what we say. The good news is we really don't. And it's best if we solve these issues at the ballot box. And it's best if, this is the beautiful thing about the system of government that the founders gave us. They gave us a system of government with built-in checks and balances and dispersion of government power to where you didn't have to worry about any one branch becoming so big and so heavy and so oppressive that it would actually pose a threat to your liberties. They also set the branches kind of at odds with each other, so that one could check another if they started to get out of line. But today we see a lot of collusion. We see a lot of abdication of responsibility on the part of the legislative branch. Kick it over to the courts, let them decide. Kick it over to the executive branch, let them just, do it through, executive fiat. But the bottom line is there is a very clear lack of control of that political power. And I'm afraid that the folks on the left who are pushing for these open primaries and trying to game Idaho's election system, they see that as an opportunity. And they can do it under the cover of legitimacy because they can say, well, look, we won the election. Obviously, enough people agreed with us. You have to do exactly what we say. That's not how it works in a republic. Now, if you're talking about a lynch mob, yeah, absolutely. What the majority wants, the majority gets. But in a republic, the government itself is supposed to abide by rules. So I like whatever applies friction to the growing state. And sadly, in Idaho, we have a lot of legislators who talk the talk of, well, I'm a conservative and I like to vote for lower taxes and I support the Second Amendment and all that stuff. But when they get to the Capitol, they legislate just like their left-wing counterparts. There's really no difference between them. And by the way, that goes all the way up to the office of the governor, at least at this point. Is that an extreme thing to point out? Maybe. I guess it would be seen as extreme to anybody whose power might be threatened by someone noticing and saying, hey, that's not right. So it's time to be in the game. We can't just argue from the sidelines. We can't just protest and, catcall those who are in the game. We need to be participating and paying attention. And I would say study as many points of view as you can. Take a look at what Jim Jones has to say. Take a look at what Brian Allman has to say. And then decide for yourself. Just know, the corporate media is going to try to steer you in a predictable direction on this. If they're using name-calling, if they're using fear-mongering, chances are they're having to resort to those artificial types of leverage because they can't convince you on their own. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.